Okay, we are right at 2 p.m. Welcome to our colloquium today. Usually whenever we have a colloquium, we have one speaker. Now we have 5 of us up in front of you. This will be pretty informal. If you want to ask questions throughout, clarification, questions about telescopes in the Arctic, polar bears, etc., please do. Couple things. One, you can see we're all very fashionable today. These pants were all of the rage in Norway, and so on our way out, we had to all get one. Called the fancy pants.
Can y'all stand up and that?
Someone's bent on the side, you know, nice work here. Another thing, my shoes are sitting at the door. I'm not wearing shoes right now. Every building in Svalbard, except for some of the bigger shopping centers, they required you to take your shoes off. This was a leftover from the coal mining days, where whenever you entered the door, you had dirt and dust all over your boots. Rather than track that through the buildings, you took your shoes off at the door, and it had stayed till now. So whenever we went under the telescope, we took our shoes off. Whenever we went into the mess hall, we took our shoes off. And so there's a little taste of that too. So the title here is Expedition to the Arctic, Salvaging the Ny-Ålesund 20-meter telescope. And up in front of you, this is the slide that I used for a talk that I gave there to tell them a little bit about Green Bank. So we have the Green Bank 100-meter, obviously, the Green Bank 20-meter, and the Ny-Ålesund 20-meter that are twins or sister telescopes built by the same company at around the same time. And the impetus for this trip was that they were getting rid of their 20-meter and replacing it with 2 13-meters. We'll talk a little bit more about that now, but here's the new 13-meter design. They have 2 of them paired together to work on the same types of science as the 20-meter was. What is that science? We'll talk about that in just a couple of slides. So our objective for going way, way up north was to salvage pieces from their Ny-Ålesund 20-meter telescope, which again was a twin to ours. The telescope was being decommissioned. It had its last observation the Monday that we left Green Bank to head to Norway. So its final light was Monday, August 14th. And they had all of these spare pieces that otherwise would have been just turned in for scrap. They would have gotten the money out of them for steel or aluminum or whatever it would be. But those pieces were much, much more valuable to us than just their weight in scrap. So whenever we found out that they were decommissioning this telescope 2 years ago, Frank got an email from them asking about some stuff. He passed it on to me. We asked, hey, could we just come and take it? And they said yes. So they gave us whatever pieces we were going to be able to salvage from their telescope for free. The cost for us was getting there and shipping it back to the US. So here's an outline for today. We'll talk a little bit about the Ny-Ålesund and Green Bank 20 meters, their history, some of the work that they work on. Anthony and Edgar will talk about deconstructing the instrument, and then Bryn and Adam will talk about some of the other experiences we had there, some about the life in Ny-Ålesund. So again, some of these slides are from a talk that I gave there, but we talked about this thing called geodesy. So the Earth spins on its axis, that's one day, right? It also points towards Polaris, that's our North Star, but Polaris won't always be the North Star. There's a tens of thousands year period that its pole changes location. So that's another movement of the Earth on its axis. But in addition to those 2 really regular movements, there's also a wobble there. There's some more movement that is less predictable. So if you spin a top, you see some of these same things. You spin it, you see it spinning around, you see maybe its axis moving around, but there's also that jiggle. The Earth does the same thing. And if we want our GPS system to work, we have to understand what that wobble looks like. So that's the original reason that our 20-meter telescope was built. It was built to work in concert with telescopes around the world to measure this wobble. The Ny-Ålesund telescopes still work on this, whereas our instrument has moved on to some other projects. But whenever you see the Ny-Ålesund telescope pointing at an object, it's pointing at something called a quasar. A quasar stands for a quasi-stellar radio source. You can see that contrived acronym that was thrown together there. These are also sort of active galactic nuclei, and these are massive quantities of gas that are falling into distant supermassive black holes that are extremely bright and pretty regular in their brightness. Some of them do drift over periods of months or years, but in general, many of them are fairly stable. So these are really far away. We can measure where they are really precisely and use telescopes around the world to measure their locations. Now, when you use two telescopes together, like let's say one in Green Bank and one in Norway, you get really, really good resolution. This is why things like the Very Large Array exist, or the Very Large Baseline Array, the VLBA, because the further apart your telescopes are, the better resolution you have. It's the same as having a gigantic telescope that would be the size of the distance between your two sites. Obviously, building a telescope that is the size of the continent of North America is not feasible, but you can build telescopes that are that far apart and use them together. So why do we need to know where a quasar is very, very accurately? Well, remember again that the Earth wobbles on its axis slightly, while this distant quasar should not be moving. So if you see that quasar moving with respect to where you think it is, it's not actually the quasar that's moving, it's the Earth moving in some way that you might not understand. So if you measure that wobble, you've detected something cool about the Earth's motion. Now, we have telescopes around the world that are doing this kind of work, not just in Green Bank and in Norway, Chile, South Africa, California, all over the place, for their great spatial resolution and their ability to measure some local differences in the Earth's motion. So that's why you want telescopes around the world also, not just concentrated in the Northern Hemisphere or in the Southern Hemisphere, for instance. Now, in 2000, our Green Bank 20 meter stopped this kind of work. The Navy was originally running the 20 meter for these geodesy experiments here, and they stepped away from our 20 meter. So they gave the telescope to the observatory, whereas these Ni-Allison telescopes continued operating for these types of programs through current day. So on Monday, August 14th, as we talked about, the Ni-Allison 20 meter had its final light and was officially replaced by those two 13-meter telescopes very nearby. What's the future of these instruments? Well, we currently use the Green Bank 20 meter to support graduate research programs, undergraduate, high school research. We also use it as a training instrument for teaching people how to use radio technology. And it's incorporated into, probably at this point, hundreds of undergraduate astronomy curricula around the country. Kardverket is the name of the Norwegian mapping authority that owned the 20 meter there. They're essentially the AUI of this 20 meter. And they donated all of the pieces to us so that they could have a second life somewhere else. They weren't just scrapping the material. It's a nice feel-good story about international collaboration in astronomy. And we got to become really good friends with some of the folks there that we could potentially have future collaborations with here in Green Bank. One of them, for instance, is planning on coming to the Single Dish School next year. But that's a little bit of the history of our telescopes and the mission, but we'll get into some pictures here about the actual deconstruction. So take it away, Anthony and Edgar.
Hey, everybody. So everyone knows, so we left from Washington, D.C. It was a pretty long trip for us to get there. It took us roughly 3 days. Most of that, there's only 2 planes a week that fly into Ni-Allison, so it was very important that we didn't miss any kind of flights. So we spent the night in Oslo and then flew to Longyearbyen, which is on the island of Svalbard, and we stayed the night there so we couldn't miss our plane, which we nearly didn't miss our plane. we had a little bit of
So they gave you here from Susanna, who's the station manager.
Bueno, que por cierto, casi perdemos.
I'm gonna mute Susanna here real quick, but she was frantically texting us, asking where we were for our plane.
There was a little bit of confusion there where our plane tickets had a different time than we actually left. So we showed up early.
My lost luggage saved the plane trip.
Adam
We
lost
got
his
there
luggage. So we showed up thinking we were early, but we were right on time. So we didn't miss the plane and everything. It worked out fine there. But if you were to miss the plane, you'd have to wait 4 additional days or possibly take a boat, which costs around $400 for a one-way trip to Galveston. So after our days of travel, we finally arrived on a Thursday evening in Galveston, just in time for dinner. So, which they took eating very serious there. So when it's time to eat, it's time to eat. Everyone sits down, eats as a community. They had incredible food. It was cooked every single day for us. But that evening we went and looked at the telescope so we could start our mission that we were there to do. So just take down the telescope. So the team, as you see, myself, Anthony, Edgar, Adam, Bren, Will, we were the Green Bank crew. And as you also see, Susanna, who was laughing there a minute ago, she was the station leader for Car Bearcat while we were there. Leif Morton was an engineer that had been working with Car Bearcat for many years. And Ole Johan was our safety man, who was also an engineer as well. But they wanted him to come there just to make sure we were doing things correctly.
I'll also point out a lot of the local support from folks here, many in this room.
Yeah, all the division heads had a hand in this. Jim had a lot to do with it, helping us out. Pete, Brian, John Shelton, Jason Ray, everyone. Christine was graciously helped us out with any kind of money issues that we had. So it was a lot of thanks. It took a lot of people to make this happen. And Will, I would like to say, was very organized and did a lot for us leading up to this trip. So we could have done it. So he spent many months working this out. So.
Yeah, deconstructing the telescope is a whole lot easier than trying to fix something on the telescope. You could take pretty drastic measures as long as you kept the parts you want safe. So it was a little easier getting like panels off. We just took a grinder and cut the bolts off, then worked on them on the ground. We're not in any dangerous situation. All of the gearboxes, motors, we could pretty much use some pretty drastic force to loosen up wheels, bolts, without having to worry about putting them back on. So it was a.
Edgar's a wild man with a grinder, just. Watch when he grabs it.
So the first week we were there was interesting just because one, we lost 6 hours while getting there, so you're weirded out. Then the sun didn't set obviously for the first, we were there for the first sunset technically, but it just dipped below the horizon. But so Leif Morton, who was, I mentioned earlier, is a go-getter. So if we wanted to do something, he was, let's go do it. Let's tear stuff down right now. So we worked a lot first week. We were, like I said, they took their meals seriously. So we would eat breakfast and we would go work, and then we would eat lunch, then we would go work, then we would eat dinner, then we would go work. Because it was just the sun never set. So it seemed like what we didn't know what else we were going to do. Plus, when I felt like when we first got there, the weather seemed very cold to us all, I believe. We were all pretty bundled up. We got used to the weather as the week went on. But the first main thing that we did, as you see Edgar up there, was we took the panels off. That was the first day that we started working. Basically, we tore into that, which was important to us because we have the little shipping container that was 20 foot by 8 foot. So we had to fit all these pieces into there. So the first key to that was, what are we going to do with all these panels? Because they're pretty big. We don't want them sliding around. We don't want them to get damaged. We don't want the paint to get messed up. So Adam and Will did a really good job getting that set up originally. Then we could build everything else around it. You see there, Will's up. So Will and Adam pretty much built every single one of those boxes that you see. I mean, a lot of them, they had some pretty decent pieces that we could stack together, but they built all the lids, worked out how the pallets were going to sit in. Adam drew everything out before we started. And we had minimal room for error would you
Yeah,
say?
and the plans kind of changed as we went. We knew they had a brand new elevation gearbox, and we knew we were gonna make sure we got at least one azimuth gearbox. But then we wound up taking everything that we could. And so things definitely changed around. We had some different initial plans, and luckily we changed them early enough. We didn't lose any time for it.
Are those the panels in the very back of the?
Yes, back in the
Okay.
center in the
They're
back.
small.
Yeah, they look small right there. They're really big though. Once you back.
Yeah, they're different lengths, and some of those are almost 8 feet long, so you can't see them behind the pouch, and we had just enough room to get the cabinet. Yeah, it was tight.
Another thing, all these pieces are extremely heavy, a lot of them, so getting the weight distributed evenly was also a plan that had to be done, because if, you know, we could pack everything in there as much as we want to, but if it rolls when they're trying to ship it and then smashes everything to pieces, everything is tacked down multiple ways, so there should be zero movement. But we did take bets on that to see.
It is on Sharpie in the container for proof.
Here's me working on the PDU cabinet. Their telescope is set up a little differently than ours. Theirs was about 8 feet shorter than ours, because ours, like the very bottom base, all of our electronics and everything is inside the base of the telescope. Theirs was in a whole other building that was off to the side. So everything was very nice and clean in there, we'll say. As you know, the weather is pretty cold, so there's no mice. There were minimal, maybe like 10 flies that we saw. So, and it's as old as our telescope, so it was very, very well kept and taken care of. Into the side, the next picture over there, I think we're pretty much done with anything we wanted to take down at that point. We're just trying to box everything up, and that's myself and Edgar, I believe, looking at the motor, and then Adam's in the back fitting the top to that base there. So we went into this thinking we need a gearbox for each, the azimuth and the elevation. We need a motor. All the motors are interchangeable. We can use them on any piece. So we wanted the PDU cabinet, any kind of spare circuit boards that we could get, any kind of software, because the software that we're running is very, very hard to come by. So that was our main concern. So I think before we started, it was like, well, as long as we get these pieces, we're good to go, which it didn't take us long to get those pieces down. So then we thought, well, we got time, and Leaf Morton was pushing us on. So we took down pretty much anything we could get down.
We like one gearbox, I have them all.
They had an issue. They had a brand new gearbox they put on, and it wasn't, they bolted it in place, and it wasn't securely bolted. I guess it was an accident, and it slightly ripped off and sheared off one of the gears on the gearbox itself. So when they put the next one on, they welded it very securely, to the point where we couldn't get it off. So
Is there a weight limit on how much you can ship in that container?
there was, but what was it, like 56,000 pounds?
Yeah, I think it was 22,000 kilometers, kilograms.
So we were pretty far under in terms of that. We brought a lot of stuff back, but the weight was not that shit.
We had guessed that we were putting 7,000 kilograms in it, and when they weighed it, we had put 6,800 kilograms in it. So, pretty good.
I haven't really mentioned Bren in this situation, so she helped on all aspects of it, and she also took care of all the customs paperwork. Every single piece, I mean, it's hard to tell from here, but all those boxes are completely packed full of stuff. So every single piece, from a battery, we didn't ship batteries, but let's just say like from a screw to a gigantic motor, had to have a serial number, had to have a price, had to have, like, everything was accounted for.
So I learned a lot more about telescope parts than I ever thought I would know. So I can tell you what a tachometer carbon brush looks like now. So, but yeah, there were quite a few parts. They had many spares, and they kept everything really well labeled. So it was pretty easy. But yeah, so a lot of the stuff is 20 years old and it's not sold anymore. So you're just sort of guessing on prices, and then accounting for inflation and everything. And then Joyce did a lot of the actual tariff codes. Because in order to ship internationally, you have to have those tariff codes. But thankfully, it was all radio astronomy based, which has zero tax on it. So we're not gonna be getting taxed on anything that could only be used on a radio astronomy instrument.
Bert mentioned spare parts, so they had many spare parts. So at first I was kind of disappointed in Green Bank, no offense to Green Bank, because we don't have the spare parts. So I thought, why do we not have this? But they do. Till you realize, like, we shipped two boxes full of a little bit of tools, some boots, some of our winter clothing there, and it took what, a month and a half, 2 months. So
If 5 day shipping and it took a month.
yeah,
and a
that was
half.
a 5 day shipping. So then you understand, like, you have to have the parts, because if you don't have it, it breaks. You can't get a new one. We deal with lead times here. Everybody does when we're trying to buy parts, which is bad, but there was extremely bad. So they were very prepared for something to break, which I thought was impressive. They planned far into the future. It's impressive. That was our last day of packing everything up. So we flew the old Green Bank flag and took a picture of us. As you can see too, we're not too loaded down with clothing at that point. We've come to terms with the cold.
It was about 40 degrees every day there, pretty much. The sun didn't set, so there's no reason for the night to be colder than the day. So it was about 40
Just
degrees.
seems the winds changed quite often. I noticed, and like there was all these, the mountains were pretty large, but they were relatively steep, and then there was glaciers in between every single mountain. So as the winds changed, you could feel the wind coming off the glacier, which was cold. But that, like I said, it would feel like it would be 25 degrees, and then all of a sudden, flip of a coin, the winds changed, and now it's 40 degrees outside. It was interesting how fast it changes. And Susanna had sent some pictures there. That's after we had left, and the deconstruction team actually started taking it down. So that all that's coming down for scrap at this point. That was after we left. And you can't quite see, but there's now, we've been gone 1 week, and the whole place is snow covered. It took 1 week for the weather to change so much there. That's the.
Any questions for Anthony, Edgar, et cetera, about taking pieces off the structure? We can do more questions at the end, but.
Because they kept the receiver.
Yes, they kept the receiver. It's a cryo units. The receiver was a little smashed up.
They dropped
It had taken a hit once, and yeah, they were going to keep it. So all their cryo units were a little different than ours too. They were much smaller units than what we were running.
Something, what the most surprising thing you found while taking down parts, besides the fact that they had so many spare parts, like mechanically, what was the most surprising thing that you found?
I guess for me personally, I should have assumed this, but the same company built ours that built theirs. So, we're in Europe, and I was expecting to have a hard time finding tools, but all their tools were in a US standard tool. All the screws were US standard. Everything was exactly like ours, pretty much, barring that theirs was a little shorter than ours, and all the electronic controls were in a different building. It was, it was like stepping into the exact same telescope. They had a couple of differences there. We run oil pumps to pump into the gearboxes, which we always have trouble with those freezing up in the wintertime, and they were having the same issue. And they completely got rid of that and filled up their gearboxes. So that's something we took back that we might be able to use because we had trouble multiple times a year as a failure. But if it worked up there in the cold, it should definitely work down here.
I have one quick question. What was the most drastic force you're talking, Edgar?
Well, we looked at, with Leaf Morton, his idea was if we can't break the welds, we'll just run the telescope and slam on brakes. He would go drastic with anything. If we needed to get it off, he had a way. So we had any force available that we wanted to use right up to the telescope itself if we needed to tear something loose. So
And we did use some of the people, so that town, briefly to talk about their town. It's kind of government owned, I guess you would say, and it's ran by a company called Kings Bay, which is like a contractor, government contractor that takes care of any type of maintenance, the food, any type of construction, things like that. So we planned on using 2 of their guys and their like heavy equipment for about 16 hours, which we ended up using 2 guys for maybe 2 hours. It didn't take us very much, but we did have help with that. So we took like all the gearboxes and motors, we winched them down ourselves into a place where they could just come up and pick it with a piece of heavy equipment. So it went very smoothly. The tear down aspect.
And ours was breaking the gearboxes loose, I guess, was probably really our biggest thing, and it was a wrench with a 12 or 16-foot pipe.
Yeah.
And 4 or 5 guys breaking the bolts loose.
Gravity.
Gravity, that was one thing we brought back, gravity works. Leave Morton, you could just say gravity and throw it off.
Some of the stuff like the gearboxes up on the elevation are sitting horizontally, or I guess they're attached horizontally to the telescope. So, but then there's these big, like 1-inch dowel rods, metal dowel rods that have been hammered into place and they're pinned into place. So for a day, we thought about like, how can we get these off? We were going to also use some force of the telescope or some other type of means, but Edgar came up with a good idea and he ended up welding a piece of all thread, which is like a large bolt essentially. And we ended up twisting and pulling them vertically out. So it did take us a day to get those out, but if we up until that point, we weren't going to take those gearboxes because we didn't know how to get those pins out. But
And we had a brand new one in the crate.
yeah, and we also had a brand new one. But then we had some time, so we Edgar came up with that idea and we did it ourselves. So.
Bryn, do you want to take us on a tour of
Sure.
life?
Yeah. So Nyalson has a radio quiet zone, just like how we have a radio quiet zone. So within 20 kilometers of Nyalson, it's protected. So they have the same signs we sort of have hanging up around everywhere: turn off Wi-Fi and Bluetooth on all your devices, light mode on. And this is also really important because they have cruise ships coming in all the time with tourists. And so those cruise ships, of course, now all come with Wi-Fi because you want Wi-Fi on your cruise. And so that's the main way tourists can come to the island. It's actually really interesting. You'll be just going to dinner and you have a pack of 150 tourists that come onto the island, increase the population by 2 for a brief period. But yeah, they have all of their devices. And so for us, it was very normal because it's a radio quiet zone. I had all my adapters and I was ready to go. But for a lot of people who also come to research, I think they're not exactly prepared for that either, because they live in cities where they don't have to worry about that. So Wi-Fi is an issue, Bluetooth is an issue as well. And for the cruise ships, it's also another big issue for the new telescopes because they operate from 2 to 32 gigahertz. And the cruise ship radar has blown out amplifiers for them multiple times. So they actually have a 15-degree limit on those telescopes because of those radars just blowing out amplifiers regularly. So the quiet zone is taken very seriously there. There's also other research going on that needs that quiet zone as well. So that was very familiar for us. Yeah.
What other research besides radio astronomy needs the quiet zone?
So they have some downlinks for satellites there as well. So that also needs the quiet zone and they use that. But we'll talk a little bit more about what research they did in just a little bit. Here we go. So the type of research done on site, so the geodesy with the radio telescopes, they do a lot of climate research there as well. So they're looking at permafrost and glaciers. So everything in Nyalson, all the buildings are actually built on stilts because you're building on permafrost rather than say bedrock or something. So actually when they were building the new telescopes, they had to dig down really deep in order to reach that bedrock. And one of the reasons they chose the spot they built it on, even though it was close to the bay, was because they could get to bedrock there. So that's kind of cool. So you can see Arctic foxes like running underneath the buildings because everything's up on stilts. And they do a lot of glacier research there. So we met a lot of marine biologists. There's quite a few. I think there's like 11 different research stations there, and most of them are marine biology. So they're studying runoff from glaciers. They're studying how the rocks in the area are moving. And so every time you talk to somebody, you got to hear about some cool new marine biology research. Which I was a little out of my depth. I haven't taken biology since like freshman year of high school. So we had very different, we were those radio astronomers. And so the research was very interesting that we got to hear about from everyone. And then there was a lot of wildlife. So we unfortunately didn't get to see the Arctic foxes when they were white because it was summer. So Arctic foxes, they change from like a gray brown color to white in the winter. So you saw a lot of them running around. We saw some whales out in the bay. There's something like 20 different species of whales that will come up into Kings Fjord or Kings Bay. And we also saw quite a few birds, and we saw reindeer, quite a few reindeer, and those were pretty cool. Not quite as majestic as you would think they looked. They're kind of short and round. But yeah, and then the infrastructure is all managed by Kings Bay. You can see how short they are. The reason they're so short, though, is a kind of cool evolutionary trait. Niallison doesn't have any trees or large vegetation because of the winds and the snow and just the environment. So it's all these little microgreens you can sort of see down at the bottom of that picture. So the reindeer have evolved to be short so they can reach the ground. And then during the summer, they eat a lot of greens and everything, and they get really round. So they're not as round in the winter, but they were. I had this picture in my head of like Santa's reindeers that like looked super majestic like horses, and then you look at that and you're like, oh, no. They're just sort of sitting there. And they're very much like our deer; they're everywhere. So yeah, I would say reindeer or Niallison's just regular deer for us, but they're quite funny. Yes.
Is the ground under the vegetation, is it spongy or is it gravel?
Yeah, so a lot of places it's spongy. It is really spongy. In fact, when we took some of the hikes, you had to be very careful where you were stepping because it was pretty spongy. But then other areas is more firm. So it just sort of depended. So like that green area would have been extremely spongy on that picture. Yeah.
A lot of the areas around town were protected due to the science. So they protected the probably 10 or 15 acres just outside of town. You had to stay on the paths or through town. You walked on boardwalks or on the road itself.
Yeah. And then during the summer, there's also the bird sanctuaries that are sort of in town. So they have multiple bird sanctuaries. You're not allowed to walk there during a certain portion of the year. That ended right before we got there. So thankfully we were able to walk in some areas that we wouldn't have been able to previously. And then, yeah, we had a very daily routine, like Anthony said. So 7:30 to 8 a.m. you had breakfast. From 8 a.m. to noon, we would work at the observatory. 12 to 1, it was lunch, and it was always like you're going. So actually, we usually would go to lunch about 15 minutes later. So they sort of have a rule where researchers go 15 minutes after the start time so that all of the Kings Bay employees can go get food first. Because otherwise you have a mad rush. During the summer, there's about 150 people there, which drops down to 30 or 40 in the winter. So it's kind of busy in the summer. Everybody's coming to do their research. And then from 1 to 4:30, we'd work again at the observatory. 4:45 to 5:30, we would have dinner. We would go work at the observatory again. And then they had a shop that was open that's open regularly 2 days a week for 1 hour. And you can get your touristy items, and then you can also get like a random assortment of things. I don't know if you want to talk any more about the schedule.
On Thursdays, there's also another meal. So I think in the first 48 hours, we ate about 7 times.
Yeah.
And we got there at dinner time, and then also we hit the store, and then they had the hot dog party on Thursdays at the bar. So it was just food. It seemed like every 10 minutes, every time you turned around, it was food. But
Adam joked, we were talking to some folks, they said, what are you going to bring back? And Adam said 10 pounds.
But surprisingly, I lost 9 pounds. I mean, so the food, though you ate a lot, I don't think there were hardly any preservatives or any deep fried junk food, or I didn't eat a bunch of candy. If you wanted something, if you wanted a Coke, you had to buy it at the store on Monday or Thursday unless a cruise ship was there. And so it definitely changed my diet quite a bit for the better. And but it was excellent food. I mean, overall, it was amazing.
So you walk in, the service station is where you have your meal and everybody eats together. It's very much reminiscent of like a college dining hall, I would say, because you just have these tables and you sit together, and you had, like, we would sit with the cart frigate crew a lot, then you would sit sometimes with some marine biologists and just random people. But you would walk up and every day you had like a special. And so we would have like fish stew, and then oftentimes the fish were caught right in the bay. We had reindeer stew
That was
there
my
as
favorite.
well.
And I believe those were fresh because at the airport, if you have a problem reindeer, they disappear into a stew apparently. And they didn't let me partake in that. So.
But so you would see that, and then after the hot dog party, you would be eating hot dogs for like 2 days. So
They were very good at the chefs there, and whatever the meal was for dinner, turning it into something else the next day, not leftovers. It was a whole different meal using the same thing.
so the ship for food only comes in like once a month during the summers, and sometimes even less in the winter. So you have to be creative about the food that's coming in because you can't waste it. And so you'll notice that fruit at the beginning of that month is pretty abundant. You can get a lot of fruit towards the end. You start to notice there's less fresh food, and that it's maybe a bit harder to.
Bananas were a hot commodity.
Yes.
If you had a banana, you were rich.
Yes.
Reuben.
They also had science talks throughout. Most of these were marine biology. I probably gave the only radio astronomy talk there
Yeah,
in several years.
it was very well attended, but not many people knew much about radio astronomy at all, which is kind of cool. So.
And then so they mentioned the Pulsa Pills, which is the hot dog party on Thursday, and is why we have hot dogs for after here that will be grilled if you want to stick around and grab a hot dog. I think I probably had on average 2 hot dogs per day if I average them out throughout the time, plus a lot of other really good food, but lots of hot dogs too. And then Saturday night, because it's so isolated, they have a dance party too. So we had our dance party every Saturday night. We were there.
Is the hot dog different? I'm assuming it's different than the American hot dog?
Yeah, it is
or-
different.
It is.
A little bit longer.
It's more like a
yeah.
sausage.
And the way that they were served was interesting too. When you asked for a hot dog, the first question was, do you want a bun? And I was like, what? Or yeah, bread. And then the other options were naked, so just a hot dog, or with a bun, or with a tortilla that was about this big, and the hot dog was about that.
But their tortillas were made from potatoes, like a potato flatbreads.
So on the site or at Neallison, there are several small cabins scattered around. Some you got to take a boat to, some you can hike to. We were able to take one we went to Brandel, and we got to look in several different ones, but Brandel was the one that we were eating there in that previous picture, and we had so we had a big hike that day. It was one day we had free on a Saturday or something, and we walked up to Brandel that evening and had some dinner. So at the cafeteria, you could order food to take with you, so you didn't have to eat at the cafeteria. You could order your food, and they package you up a nice picnic lunch basically. And so we went up and we got to hang out and check out the cabin and start a fire, and just partake in some of the kind of ritualistic things that you would do if you were there. So it's kind of a getaway from a getaway.
It was kind of cool for that one. That one's right down by the telescope. So the new telescopes, the site's called Brandel as well. And so you have the two 13.4 meters right there in the sun. And because the sun was like coming directly behind it, so you can see the whole shadow. And then you're just like a 2-minute walk away from the telescopes, which was really cool to be able to just like look out the window. And there's these two really, really amazing instruments.
These cabins though are outside of the town, so to get there, you have to, like Adam mentioned, you can walk, you can take a boat, whatever, but you're still going outside of the protected zone. So just to go to a cabin, you have to have people that have firearms, some type of polar bear protection. So like the one picture that we saw, that was the whole Cart Bearcat crew. And the other interesting thing about those cabins is some were new looking, like they built them down on site, like the maintenance, it was a new cabin that they took out and set in place, but the one we were at had been there for
It looked terrible.
like
on the outside.
100+ years, I'd say.
But on the inside, it was actually really, really nice. It was- And so people will leave a list, hey, we need candles at this one, or we need some firewood at that one. And so they would keep a running tally so that they were always pretty well stocked up for the bare essentials, not polar bear essentials, but bare essentials.
And they keep cabin books, so you can actually see people who stayed there 50 years ago. And we left a note in the cabin books just saying like we stayed there and how much we enjoyed it. So it's kind of fun. You would look back and you would see like some of the people we were with were like, oh, I stayed in this cabin like 20 years ago. So that was kind of cool. But
So on our first big excursion, that's the top couple pictures there, we decided we were gonna, I think it was Friday evening, wasn't it?
yeah,
The first Friday. We decided after we were done working, we were gonna take a hike. And so we decided to go to this glacier that looked pretty close.
it was not.
It was not very close. So we dilly-dallied. I think every rock got a picture, every flower got a picture, we saw possibly a petrified tree, we don't know. And on the way back, we took a shortcut. And that shortcut took us across this pretty large kind of alluvial floodplain from glacier runoff. We got down there was no crossing. And there was no getting around it without going all the way back around. And it looked pretty shallow. We tossed a couple of rocks. And I'm thinking in my head, we're gonna have to cross this. And I look up, and there's Edgar,
across.
pants up around the knees, holding his shoes just to go across. And I'll just say, now, that was some cold water, and we were going back because I had decided, our safety man, Willie Johan, he was gonna do the swim. He was gonna go swimming in the bay. I said, I'm gonna go too. And so we were already prepped for that. But that water there was cold. So when you were walking across the rocks, it felt like knives were just slicing the bottom of your feet. You'd think you'd hit a soft spot and you think, oh, it's gonna be okay. And then it wasn't okay.
You see, my foot looks, it's red. I mean, it took 45 seconds to cross it, maybe.
Yeah. And
It was terribly cold.
it's straight up glacier, just glacier water. There's no other water.
And once Edgar decided to go, because it's, once again, you're carrying rifles, only some of us. So you can't
Couldn't
You
separate.
can't separate it, so you can't leave a man behind.
Edgar got us all in that. The bottom two pictures were the second walk we got to take. Well, maybe not both of them, but the second kind of excursion we got to take out. We wanted to go up to another glacier. We heard that there was this beautiful blue pond on the glacier from some of the surface runoff collecting, and then it would pool up and go on down. And so we walked up to that, and it was actually a pretty quick walk, and it was just beautiful. I mean, it's just, the pictures don't really do it justice. The colors and the scenery is just, it's something that's probably going to be forever with all of us, I'm sure.
We had a guide for that one, essentially, Ruben, who works for Cart Bearcat. They were leaving, Ruben and Susanna were leaving the same day we were leaving, so they were gonna be gone for 6 to 8 weeks, so I believe he wanted to go on a hike pretty bad, so he took us. It was a pretty long hike.
Yeah,
When we started out with, I was hoping to go to the top of this really pretty prominent mountain, and we decided, I got outvoted, so we went to the glacier. And then we said, well, we could go up over this mountain that goes by one of the air quality observatories. And so after we were there at that pond, we did cross the mountain and got to see a whole nother view of one of the glaciers of the edge of the ice sheet that we took a boat to. So I got to have my cake and eat it too.
It's really that bottom right-hand picture, kind of, from a distance, it looks like, oh, that glacier is just right there, but there's no trees to gauge any kind of distance off. That's one thing I realized, like, it was really hard. It was really tough to gauge how far you were walking because there was nothing to compare it to. You just saw these giant mountains and these big glaciers. It just looked like, oh, it's a mile across, but it would be 6 miles.
And everything's just loose rock.
Yeah.
So you have to be careful everywhere you're stepping. Like what looks like, oh, it might be just like the side of a mountain. It's all just loose rock that if you step in the wrong place, everything's gonna.
Yeah.
So you're pretty aware of where you're putting your next step every single time.
And you're watching for polar bears all
Yes.
the time because they do cross through
Yeah.
there. They kind of skirt around town a lot and then cross through that glacier and that other glacier. We actually saw some tracks.
Speed up just a little bit.
Captain Edgar. So we couldn't drive a truck. We couldn't do any of that, but we could rent a boat for about $20. And we could go to Greenland if we wanted to, as long as your captain was born before 1980.
Yeah.
And so Edgar, you didn't have to ever drive a boat before. Edgar hadn't. So Captain Edgar took us out, and we got to go see the sights, and you had to wear your life suits, and you know, if you fell in, you can see mine's unzipped because if I zipped it up, my face would be against the neoprene, so I couldn't breathe. So if you fell in, you had 4 minutes, and that was just to find the body. Really, is all that was for. That's what Morton told us.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That ice sheet behind us doesn't look that big, but it's gigantic,
Yeah.
like 150 plus feet tall, what do
Yeah.
you say? And then the water also, that bay, to quickly say, it looks like it's maybe 3 miles wide, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
But it's roughly 1,400 feet deep in places. It's serious
Very
ocean right there on the small.
A lot of icebergs too, which of course, you know, you can only see 10%. And then I led the most northern CrossFit class. So I was actually stopped by a receptionist, was like, hey, I hear you do CrossFit, do you want to coach class? Because they have a gym and like a fitness center. And so I led a CrossFit class, which was quite fun. We had about 15 people there. So it's just a subset of the people that were there. And the gym's really nice. So it's sort of like, well, it's nicer than our gym because there's windows. But but it was really nice to be able to have that so that when it's 9 p.m. and it's still light out and you're like, oh, what do I do? You can go to the gym.
Why was Bill wearing it?
Yes. It's a good question.
I'm not sure, Angela. So Anthony and I, the first day that we got there, second day we got there, had a polar bear safety course. As we talked about, there's a perimeter where anyone could walk around. So within this blue zone, anyone could walk around. If you went out of there, you were required to have polar bear protection. So we had to take a course where we could carry the firearms, and they were 308s that we carried around for the polar bears. That is a last resort that you use a rifle against it. First is that you just gather together with everyone you're with, make yourself look big, maybe the polar bear is scared off. Second resort is we had a flare gun also. So Anthony was carrying around a flare gun that you would shoot in front of the polar bear to scare it back. And usually that is just fine. And then last case, you would use 308. So it is rare for an encounter to happen. They were saying it had been something like 10 years in the Allison before there was an encounter, but the week before we went, there was one, and unfortunately a polar bear had to be killed because it was breaking into one of the cabins. So it was a long break in between, but everyone was on alert.
It's like the bears don't come into the city because there's too much commotion, but outside of the city, they cross through there. There's seals everywhere. So in the summertime, they're lacking food, so they just basically patrol the perimeters of these peninsulas looking for seals. So if you get in the way,
Your dinner.
well, and it was funny to all the people who hunt. So they were using a 308 as a bear gun, which most bear hunters around here would say that's like a baby gun, garbage. So, but you weren't allowed to shoot a bear unless it was, you know, from me to Will away. Like if you got,
No,
if you
that's further.
yeah, 25 yards maybe. If you shot a bear at 100 yards away with a gun, you were going to be in serious trouble. So that's why those grenades, or not grenades, the flares that he's talking about was kind of, it was like a flashbang grenade that the military would use when they would throw it into a building just to make a loud bang and a light. So that's what essentially skip them into the bear to scare the bear. But yeah, those guys, there was a gentleman that was in her CrossFit picture. He taught us the class, and I asked him, just thinking like, you're just giving us this 308 because we're only here for 2 weeks. And he said, no, that's my gun's right there. And it was the exact same gun. So it was just a little bolt action 308 Browning rifle, no different than what we carry.
So we had a lot of work. There was a lot of distilled downtime that we turned into these other adventures when we were there. On our way back, again, we went through Longyearbyen, Oslo, had a layover, hour and a half or so in Paris, and arrived in DC on the night of Saturday, September 2nd. So in total, it was just under 3 weeks, where 2 of those weeks were in the Alisand. So for some of our overall impressions, first of all, I think we definitely accomplished our goal. We brought back, or are on the way of bringing back, about $1 million in spare parts for the 20 meter. These are replacement values, right? If something would go out in the gearbox and we had to replace it, that might cost us $80,000 to $100,000 to rebuild that gearbox, something like that. This was an amazing and rare opportunity to work with these partners. It's not every day that you have a telescope full of spare parts that you could go and harvest from. If we could find a GBT somewhere else, we'll be happy to go there and talk with those folks. But it was also great international collaboration for these people who were willing to just give us all of the spare parts so that they had second life in them instead of selling them for scrap, basically. So these are some of the things that we're bringing back: gearboxes, motors, blowers, spare panels, encoders, control equipment, 6,800 kilograms worth of materials. What's next? The current container is currently sitting in Tromsø, which is in northern Norway, waiting to be certified for the transatlantic journey. We were really keen on getting it out of Ny-Ålesund as soon as possible, because the next ship after we left was September 12th, and the one after that was October 30th. So if we didn't make the September 12th ship, it was going to be there for an extra month and a half, and we don't want the electronics sitting there for that long. So at the earliest, we hope to see it here in late October for unboxing. And for the 20 meter in the future, it will hopefully continue on its educational programs, but we have some discussions of potential new avenues for it, including not just the education, but satellite downlinks, or triggering it for transient discoveries. There are these new telescopes coming online that will discover all kinds of events happening nightly in the night sky. And you might want to do radio follow-up for those, but you probably don't want to trigger the GBT every time there's a warning. So this could be an intermediate instrument for something like that. Here is our last day in Longyearbyen after we got all of the pants that we're currently wearing. And Leif Morton, every time there would be a great meal or something like that, he would lean over to us and say, it's a hard life in the Arctic. So that's the end of our presentation here. Please join us for a pulse of pills afterwards, hot dog party, and we're happy to answer any other questions too.
Why are there side zippers on the pants?
To vent.
To vent?
Yeah, because they're hiking pants. So all these are hiking pants. That's so Longyearbyen is like where you go in Norway if you want to like go hike and be outdoorsy and adventurous. And so everybody was wearing these. And then what you're doing in Ny-Ålesund, a lot of people who are doing like marine biology research are hiking over like everywhere to get to their sites. So everybody was wearing them.
Okay, so they could cross the creek a little fast.
Yeah, awesome. So that, yeah.
Everyone was very prepared. They also wore lots of wool.
Yeah.
These jackets.
Yeah, these shirts.
Everything was wool to keep in the body heat, but not have to wear as much clothes. And everything, these pants, like everything was windproof. Everything is somewhat waterproof, because you could get stuck instantly out there. No one's coming to get you. So their clothing it seemed much more advanced than what we use in America for outdoor gear.
What port in the US will the container dock in?
Probably Baltimore, but we'll see.
How thick are the building walls?
So we saw some new construction there in Longyearbyen, actually kind of behind us there, and they had, I think they had a lot more offset of thermal conductors. So instead of just having a regular 2x4 wall with fiberglass insulation between it, they would have offset studs, fiberglass between them, and air gaps to not conduct the cold through the wall. So there was at least on the newer structures. Now, where we were at, I don't think it was more than a 2x4 or 2x6 wall. A lot of those buildings were 70 years old. Some of them a lot older than that. But a lot of the bunkhouse style places like where we stayed were pretty old, but they had all been pretty much renovated. So all the plumbing was surface mount on the interior. So if you were taking a shower and say your light goes out and you punch your soap dispenser in the back up in the corner, you might get branded by the hot water pipe. Just saying, I don't know who would have that happen to them. Will.
Pretty much daily.
Yeah, pretty much. You learn about in 2 weeks, you learn where not to turn around that scrub because you get burned pretty quick.
Kings Bay took care of all of the maintenance work and infrastructure, so everything the power was generated. They had 2 big generators that they would switch off and on so they could do maintenance on them. And they also had, they took care of all the plumbing, sewage, everything like that. So pretty well stocked.
Did you have trouble sleeping with 24 hours of sunlight?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think Brent and I, we were all on the same side of the building. I had trouble. I don't know anything.
I was facing, my room faced the south, so the sun was in the north on it at nighttime. But they had blinds that you could pull down, like, I don't
They had
really.
really good blinds.
They were blackout curtains, basically.
Yeah. But it's still, when you woke up, you would look for that and you would see that glare and say, oh, I gotta get up. I took pictures at 1 in the morning and it looks like that. So it's pretty difficult.
Adam apparently has to be up with the sun. I can be up with the moon. So the sun doesn't bother me.
Did you, how many sense of the glacier erosion there? Could you tell where?
Yeah, so that was probably one of the biggest things that hit me when I was there. And it was kind of a startling realization because you can see on the mountain where the glaciers were, it's discolored. So you look and some of these 2 glaciers, you talk to people like, oh, those used to connect, and then they're just completely separate now. And then you talk to them like, oh, the fjord used to freeze over, it doesn't anymore. So you're talking to people who were there like 20 years ago, and it was very real when you go up there and see that. I think it's like in my head, everyone was like, oh, okay, I know what's happening, but you see the actual effects. So they have a museum there where they actually have an exhibit on what Nyalison used to look like during the winter versus what it looks like now, and what it looks like in the summer versus what it looked like now. So you very well could see the erosion of the glaciers. And that's a lot of the research that's happening.
Angela?
I was curious if there are any issues with thawing permafrost. I mean, I know the telescopes are down at bedrock, but construction in general could be a real challenge.
Yeah, they have to periodically level the buildings. There's pretty ongoing systematic replenishment and maintenance of the buildings just because of the freeze thaw. And I know talking with Lee Morton, when they built the new telescopes, they excavated, but they did it in the wintertime because if they did it in the summertime while things were thawed on top and continued to thaw the deeper you went, you'd be dealing with just a big mud pit. It would continue to collapse. I was really surprised that they ripped, and I'm sure they had just like a single shank ripper on an excavator ripping and then digging the refuse out because otherwise you couldn't build it. And a lot of it was precast concrete segments, and then I think they either grouted or concreted within that. It's pretty interesting to see them. I mean, they built those things in the dark, at least the foundations to get them up to grade. So it's pretty cool.
Any other questions? I'll look online. If not, any final thoughts from you all?
It's worth a trip. Worth a trip. Longyearbyen is a pretty big, I would consider it like a ski town. So if you ever do decide to go, it's a worthwhile venture. I mean, they have a lot of outdoor activities through the summer and through the winter with the northern lights, snowmobiling, cross-country skiing, camping. Like you can do a lot of things there, and it's actually pretty, it's not really that expensive. I was surprised, you could buy, a Coke for $2 in the Alps, and they ship it there. I think some of the supplies were like once a year they get a big shipment. So it wasn't really that much more expensive than what I would expect.
Longyearbyen is like the last frontier for the normal person. Like you can't just, like we were talking about the cruise ships. The cruise ships come in, if you're going on a cruise to Nyalison, you get to step foot on it for an hour, basically. But Longyearbyen, anyone can go there, but that's the most northern part you can legitimately go to on your own.
And one thing we didn't mention really quickly, because we're about out of time, was that Ny-Ålesund is, or all of Svalbard is tax-free. And anyone can go there without a green card or work permit. And it's basically because of how it came about being part of Norway. After World War I, Norway was neutral and all of the countries were deciding what to do with Svalbard. And they said, well, give it to Norway, I guess. And so all of the signatories to that treaty, any of those countries are allowed to go and put settlements on Svalbard. So the United States could go and have a research station there because they're a signatory to that treaty. And that also means that anyone can go work there, pretty much. So there were people there from all over Europe, all over the world, basically working specifically in Longyearbyen, but some in Ny-Ålesund as well. Looks like Molly has her hand up. Go ahead, Molly.
Yeah, this might be a really stupid question, but do they do sensitives go there as well?
Not to Ny-Ålesund. You can't really get there to live unless you're associated with one of the research stations. And Longyearbyen isn't really a radio quiet zone.
Yeah, you can get cell service on Longyearbyen.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. With that, come have a hot dog with us. And thank you all. I mean, many of the people in this room were instrumental in making this happen. So thank you all as well.